You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
The impact of climate change will be more severe and less avoidable in the years to come, according to the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) report, which was released on 28 February. Issuing its bleakest warning yet, the new report concludes that global warming is outpacing our ability to cope, and that governments around the world are not doing enough to protect us from the hazards that climate change has already unleashed, let alone from future disasters. For India, this report says that the country could be one of those where heat and humidity levels would pass the limit of human survivability, and climate change could mean about 40% of people in India living with water scarcity compared to 33% now. I'm not gonna lie to you, the contents of this report are grim and upsetting. But like the physical science report that the panel published last year, none of this is new knowledge, and scientists have been warning about this for years. This report pertinently provides the most detailed look yet at the threats posed by global warming. It draws a direct line between climate change and serious consequences like humanitarian crisis, food insecurity, water scarcity, migration, and even premature deaths. And to combat this, nations across the world have vowed to limit the total global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared with pre-industrial levels. But what this report makes very clear is that exceeding this threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius will result in permanent lasting damage, and that even humanity's best effort to adapt could falter. You're listening to the Big Story podcast, and I'm your host Himmat. Joining me today to discuss the main takeaways from the report is Professor Anjal Prakash, the Research Director and Associate Professor of the Bharati Institute of Public Policy at the Indian School of Business, and also one of the authors of the latest IPCC report. Anjal, welcome back to the podcast. It's a pleasure having you on board as always. Now, Anjal, the latest report gives us some of the gravest warnings ever given compared to any of the past reports as well, and has also produced some responses like being the most brutal IPCC report out there. Like, for example, the report states that with very high confidence that reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term would cause unavoidable increases in multiple climate hazards and present multiple risks to ecosystems and humans, and that near-term actions can reduce the projected loss but cannot eliminate them all. This is like very, very plainly written across the report. And one of the main takeaways also from which I got from the report is that going ahead, if serious action is not taken, climate change events will not only compound, but will also occur simultaneously, which we have seen some examples of that over the past few years. So can you help us understand why this may happen and why scientists are able to say this now with such certainty, with such plain language also?
Thanks, Himmat, first of all, for having me on your show again. It's always wonderful to have a conversation with you. And I'm very happy to explain this report to the larger people, especially people who are listening to us on the Quint podcast. Thank you again for having me here. Okay, the report actually, first of all, I'll just give you a background of how is this report generated, because I think the lot of rigorous work that has been done by the scientists need to be known to the larger public. So this is the report, which is the three-part report of, one of the three parts report of IPCC. So the first part actually focuses on the science of climate change. The second part, which is actually focusing on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the third part, which is going to come almost a month from now, is going to be focusing on the mitigation aspect. So we already know what the science of climate change is telling, that it is unequivocally telling us that climate change is here and now. We have to act now. This report take it forward from the messages that we have, and it tells us what are the impacts going to be, how do we adapt, and what are the vulnerable areas that we have, both for people as well as for communities around the world. So that is one thing that is very, very eloquent in this report. As you know, that it is written by 270 scientists nominated by countries and selected by an expert panel. The scientists have been working for more than 3 years, assessing around 34,000 publications to come to a present report. This report is also peer-reviewed by scientists of the world and by governments of the world, right? So the IPCC scientists incorporated about 62,000 comments received from scientists, policymakers, practitioners, and government representatives. So this makes this report very, very rigorous, because we have gone through last 3.5 years almost to conclude some of the major changes which has happened on the climate systems around the world. So the scientists are, the rigorous process through which we have generated the evidence, and the time period was between 2014 and 2021. That means the kind of information that we have able to put together this report, which is very strongly telling us that the climate change, the impacts of this climate change are going to be in one of the most vulnerable portion of the world, and South Asia actually is included. And this is, we are telling it with so much of certainty only because of the evidence that we have received. See, IPCC doesn't do its own research. It only backs upon the research which has happened during the time period that I've mentioned. So we are only assessing the information that we have, and the information which has been assessed very eloquently, unequivocally tells us that climate change is here and now, and it's going to be impacting our life very soon.
Okay. Now, since the last report came out, which was sometime in August last year as well, we also have had the COP26 summit. Like this summit was billed as the last best hope to save humanity. That was like the tagline which went even in our podcast, I believe. Now, given that the latest report states that even adequate actions by nations will not help reduce the impact of climate change, how do you assess what the government's pledge to at COP26, and does that align with what we require urgently right now?
So I think the activists around the world are not very happy with the outcome of COP26. That is what we hear from them. As scientists, I think, and as IPCC scientists, our work actually is to put the information together and tell the world in terms of the pathways that is available at this moment, right? And it is the countries of the world, the leaders of the world has to come together and respond to the question that we are raising. So as scientists, our job is done. We are placing the information on the table, and we are very strongly telling that certain stories which is there in regard to climate change is going to be impacting or is impacting our life day in and day out. Now, world order and the world leader has to take note of these things. And I think this is also a process. We have railed through certain, especially the problems of, pandemic in the last 2 years. And I am really hopeful that COP27 is going to take note of these information that we have put together. By the time COP27 happens in Egypt, we have all the 3 reports on the table, and I'm sure the world leaders will listen to us.
Okay. Now, when it comes to India, the report states that the country could witness extreme heat and humidity events in conditions which would be inhospitable for humans, which is very, very frightening also. So apart from this, the report also states that India is also one of the countries which is the most vulnerable to sea level rise. So can you shed a light on what the report speaks specifically about India?
So you know that India has most of the world ecologies in terms of if you look at 3 major hotspots regions of climate change, hotspot region in the Himalayan region, the coastal areas, and the third, what we call is the semi-arid regions, right? Let me just go one by one and explain to you what is going to be impact of climate change on these 3 hotspot areas. Let's start with the Himalayan ecosystems. Now, Himalayan ecosystems, as you know, is the most fragile ecosystem. It is the 3rd pole because it is the largest concentration of ice outside the polar region. It has, it is supporting about 10 major river basins across Asia, feeding to about 1.3 billion of humanity. What is global warming doing is that the Himalayan glaciers are retreating. It is drying up very soon, very fast. Now, the earlier prediction was that by end of the century, 2/3 of the glaciers will be retreating. But the recent models and this report also tells us that this is going to happen much sooner than what we have predicted. Mm-hmm. Now, this is all based on the business case scenarios at this moment. But the top line outcome of this that the glaciers are melting very fast because the warming, say 1.5 degree warming scenario, it is going to be impacting our lives very much. Second problems, what we see in the Himalayan region is also about incessant rain. That means the rain patterns are changing very fast. This is a very fragile ecosystem, very new mountain system. So any, for example, if there's a huge rainfall, 400 millimeters of rainfall, which has happened in Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand just last season, if that happens more frequently across the Himalayan regions, what is the impact going to be? So that's on the Himalayan ecosystem. The second portion is about the coastal ecosystems. Now, India has about 7,500 kilometers of coastline. It has a huge number of population, which is all along the coastline. Some of the major mega cities, for example, if you look at Chennai, if you see Mumbai, Kolkata, Vishakhapatnam, some of these cities are also on the coast. What is predicted by the report is that two things. One is that the ocean has actually warmed up to about 0.8 degree from the industrial time. And because it has sunk in the carbon which has been emitted in the atmosphere. So ocean is more warm, more acidic, and less productive. What is also has done is that it is feeding up to an active water cycle, leading to frequency of cyclones. So we will. It is predicted that the frequency of cyclone will be more, and also the severity of cyclones. We actually have seen last year itself there has been so many cyclones, which was unprecedented in the recent history. What is one problem is going to happen is that the cyclones are going to be striking much more. On the top, you have concentration of population is very, very high. See, urbanization in India is at 35% this point of time. About 485 million people are living in urban areas. This is expected to go up to 40%, making it about 600 million people. So these are the people who are at much greater risk, and half of or 1/4 of this, actually a more of number of people are actually on the coastal cities, and this is something that a risk is there. Second risk is about the sea level rise. So seawater intrusion into the freshwater bodies because of the global warming, the water glaciers melting, all this going along the sea. This is also going to be threatening the water security of these regions.
So, like cities like Mumbai, Chennai, or any of the coastal major cities will be impacted.
Bhubaneswar, Puri, yeah. The third challenge that we see, and the third hotspot region that we see, is the arid and semi-arid regions. India has about 54% of our land mass actually is either in arid or semi-arid regions. These are the areas which will be which will have problems of heat stroke, and humidity is going to be very high. There was an assessment done which we call the wet bulb assessment, which was part of the report, which tells us that at some point, if the wet bulb temperature goes up, it's going to be unlivable. And this is projected that most of the cities, especially cities in the semi-arid regions and the arid regions, are actually going to be facing much more of the heat stroke than it was ever happened in the recent past.
So, like, can you name a few cities, like Ahmedabad or cities in Rajasthan be one?
So, cities in the northern part, for example, western part of the city, for example, Ahmedabad. Then you have Jaipur. If you come slowly, Delhi is also very much affected, going to be by heat wave. Lucknow, Patna. If you come down, Guwahati also that sense. Then if you come down here in Hyderabad, Vijayawada, these are cities which are going to be hugely affected by the heat stroke that this report is predicting. Now, the problem is, if you see Himmat, the problem is that we are not safe from any side. If you look at the north, we are going to be struck by the glacier melt, which is impacting the river regimes, impacting the water security of the region. If you see from the bottom, you have sea level rise, you have increased cyclones. If you look at the middle part, you have these heat stroke, which is going to be there, or the heat wave is going to be much more pronounced. So India is at much greater risk. Where we look at all the geography, it is surrounded by the hotspot region, and each of these hotspot regions are directly impacted by the change in the climate change process. Okay. Each of the hotspot regions are greatly impacted by the climate change.
The report also points out that India will be one of the countries with the most economic impact because of climate change, and that agriculture, which is one of the biggest industries in India, will be massively hit. Can you speak on what the report says regarding the economic impact of India and what measures we can take right now to mitigate this?
I'll come to the agriculture first and then come to the larger issues of economy. See, the agriculture is still employing about 60% of India's workforce, and agriculture is a huge stress because of the either you have this excessive rainfall that happens, or if you have heat wave that is impacting the drought conditions. So you have extreme temperature. The weather patterns have shifted from 15 days to 3 weeks. In most part of India, and farmers are experiencing much more pronounced problems in terms of lower productivity, in terms of water insecurity. These issues are becoming an order of the day. What we also see is that the long-term projections of the weather is that it's going to be still very unpredictable. So when you want rain, the rain will not come. When you don't want, it will pour. And that means that your agriculture is a greater risk, and people who are associated with agriculture needs to be protected. So that's number one. Coming to the larger issue of businesses, first is about the cities and the climate change impact on the cities, as we have explained before. Imagine if there's twice if happens or thrice it happens that Mumbai is flooded again with incessant rain, and the city goes to standstill for 3 days or 5 days. What is the impact on the economy? There are certain businesses which are very climate sensitive in nature. They also will be directly affected. Floods are going to be seriously affecting our cities in the future, which means that the businesses are going to be directly impacted.
Okay. Now, at COP26, India made a range of pledges, including, which was the biggest one was cutting its emissions to net zero by 2070. We dedicated an entire episode to this as well when it was announced. Now, given that the reality that we read in this report, do you think that the government is doing enough, or is it even on the right path to combating the climate change events that this report says that we are going to see for sure?
First of all, I must commend, in the government of India that at least in the scenario where nobody was voluntarily saying that we will be achieving net zero, India came forward and said, okay, by 2070, we will be going net zero. That means we already have a target, which is a very good point. We also, if you do the analysis of the policies, India has one of the best policies on paper. But the problem is that the implementation of these policies. Now we have certain very good missions which is going to be curbing. But I have always been, saying this and very strongly that India needs a separate Ministry of Climate Change. Why I'm saying that there's an institutional, architecture of service delivery, especially for climate change, needs to be there, and that is where the problem lies. See, climate change is part of Ministry of Environment, Forest. It is one of the 12 divisions. So climate change is part of the Ministry of Environment and Forest. It is one of the 12 divisions that climate change division is there. That means that it is handled by a desk in some backyard of the ministry. And climate change is much more than environment and forest. See, you have a forest bureaucracy, which I have a great respect for, but climate change of today's time means you need to have the climate scientists, you need to have the modelers, you need to have people who work on adaptation, on-ground adaptation. They have to come together. It's much more an interdisciplinary subject at this moment. I am arguing that you need to have either you have to have a Ministry of Climate Change, or you have to have a separate task force which directly reports to the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, because it requires a lot of coordination with all other sectors. See, none of the sectors are actually spared from climate change. Look at urbanization, Ministry of Urban Affairs, you have Ministry of Rural Development, Women and Child Welfare, Energy, Environment, you name it, they are all affected. That means the special task force or a separate Ministry of Climate Change will be able to coordinate. Their job actually is to coordinate with all the ministries, lay out the plan which will be supported. Also, there's a problem. See, all the states have their state-specific adaptation plan, but the money is not there, right? So you have very less money, and it just requires that each and every development project has to be scanned through climate lens. You need to have the projections right. District level planning has to be done, because that's where the major problem lies. And that requires an architecture of institutional change, which is missing at this moment. And I'm arguing that this needs to happen before we take off and combat climate change.
Now, Anshul, my last question was that given what the report very plainly states is that as warming continues, it will become harder and harder for humans to cope with it. I wanted to know what needs to be done to our cities and even our lifestyles to adapt to this change, or even hopefully prevent it. So what can be done right now by us?
So you have to understand that climate change is a global phenomena with a very localized impact. That means that the impacts will be, if you're sitting in Delhi and if I'm sitting in Hyderabad, the impacts will be very different in Delhi than in Hyderabad. That means your adaptation has to be different than mine. And that's why the localized understanding of adaptation process is very, very important. the report actually very strongly brings out that we are reaching the limits of adaptation. Mm-hmm. If we are going beyond 1.5 degree by 2050, that means there are certain resources will be we cannot come back. That means the planetary bounding for adaptation will also be limiting. And that's why next 15 to 20 years are very, very crucial for us to take strong action and actually focus on adaptation, which helps the people by and large, and especially people who are marginalized. I have, worked on these issues, especially gender inequity issues. Women are much more vulnerable than men. Older women are much more vulnerable than younger women. And then other intersectional issues in terms of equities, the low caste people, people with lower socioeconomic background, they need to be protected from this change process. And that is something that we really have to take plan, but it has to be what we call at the local level. That means the district is a unit of planning. You need to have climate change trends projected at the district level. You need to have the plan which is laid out for district level planning. That is where the problem lies. And I think the problem again is that the institutional architecture is not there at this moment, which will take this to the last person.
Well, thank you, Anjul, for coming on the podcast and also primarily helping us understand the accelerating dangers of climate change, which is very, very real by the second when it comes to it. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Always a pleasure talking to you, Himmat. And thank you so much for having me. And I hope that some of these talk precipitates and, I have a huge faith in the younger people. I think as people of our generation, we have failed to protect. We have brought in the issue of climate change on the from page 4 in the newspaper to front page. But I think people like you and the other younger people must take this forward, because otherwise we are going to fail as a humanity.
If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.